Hi, I'm ALANIS Morissette. Welcome to Conversation with ALANIS Morissette. Today our guest is Dr. Gabor Maté, a renowned speaker and best-selling author. Dr. Gabor Maté is highly sought after for his expertise on a range of topics, including addiction, stress, and childhood development. Rather than offering quick fix solutions to these complex issues, Dr. Maté weaves together scientific research, case histories, and his own insights and direct experience to present a broad perspective that enlightens and empowers people to promote their own healing and that of those around them. For 12 years, Dr. Maté worked in Vancouver's downtown east side with patients challenged by hardcore drug addiction, mental illness, and HIV, including at Vancouver's supervised injection site. With over 20 years of family practice and palliative care experience and extensive knowledge of the latest findings of leading-edge research, Dr. Maté is a sought-after speaker and teacher, regularly addressing health professionals, educators, and audiences throughout North America. As an author, Dr. Maté has written several best-selling books, including the award-winning In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction, When the Body Says No, The Cost of Hidden Stress, and Scattered Minds, a new look at the origins and healing of attention deficit disorder, and co-authored Hold On to Your Kids with Dr. Gordon Neufeld. Dr. Maté is the co-founder of Compassion for Addiction, a nonprofit that focuses on addiction, and he's also an advisor of Drugs Over Dinner. Dr. Maté has received many awards for his profound contribution and the profundity of his work. It is my honor to welcome him to the conversation today. Welcome, Gabor Maté, to the show. It is a true honor to have you join us, and it feels very culminative to be having this conversation with you at the end of the year. So much of what you teach and so much of what I really think of you archetypally as a philosopher, certainly a doctor. I actually think you're a spiritual leader too. There's so many different aspects of addiction, ADD, the conversation of the war on drugs, how the brain works, the spiritual aspect, as I mentioned. You're coming at the conversation of the effects of childhood trauma on our bodies, on our relationships, on our lives from so many multitudinous angles. So I just have to start with a huge thank you for what you've contributed to the planet and to the psychotherapeutic community and to there's just a conversation around pharmacological anything. Your perspective is very sound and I can imagine really controversial at times, but your being on the what I consider to be the front lines of this conversation is such a blessing. So thank you.
Well, thank you very kindly, and great pleasure to be with you. I just mentioned that there was an ancient physician who said that the doctor has to be a philosopher.
Yes, well, God bless you doing that. You are that. And, just to give you a little context, you may or may not know, my mom and my aunt and my grandparents escaped during the revolution in 1956 from Budapest, where they're from. I didn't know if you knew that, but I know your history is such that you were in the middle of all that. And you've very transparently mentioned how it's affected your own brain development from your perspective and how it's affected your life. And so there was a resonance with that. And just to be personal for a second, your face actually reminds me of the bone structure of my family in a lot of ways. So when I've been watching you speak, I'm a creepy student watching you from afar. There's something about how you come across that reminds me so much of my family. So there's that extra element for me in there of your having had a history that a big part of my family also shares.
You haven't told me something personal. Can I share something personal with you about yourself?
Yes, please.
About my relationship with you. So I was thinking about, I talk about the addicted mind and then the hungry ghost that's inside all of us. So when you first come on the scene as a teenager and you made it really big very early, I was resentful of you. Because I said, my God, here I'm in my middle age and I've had to struggle so hard all my life. And here's this young woman with no problems at all. She just writes a song, and all of a sudden, her life is made.
Now, dear. Quote unquote.
I'm not saying that was my reality. I was saying there's a part of me that reacted that way.
Of course, yeah.
The part that's the hungry ghost, the part that's nothing is never is enough. And I also know perfectly well that wasn't your reality either,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So it's not that your life has been cakes and ale and roses. So, but I'm just talking about
Yeah.
that part of
Of
ourselves.
course.
I'm just owning that part of myself.
I love it. So
That,
was it an envy around wanting the message that you have to be shared publicly in the way that you saw it happening in my case?
well, it was even deeper than that, because at that time, I know your songs were often very honest, you know,
Mm-hmm.
but mostly it was just what struck me as the ease with which you attained what you wanted at an early age.
Mm.
Whereas for me, life had always seemed such a struggle. Now,
Mm.
I'm talking about the story I told myself.
I
I'm
get
not
it.
talking about reality
Of
here, you
course.
know?
Yeah, I get that.
I know you get it. I know you get it.
Yeah. I love the transparency, and there's a million tools in the toolbox, and for me, just knowing, sort of owning different aspects, obviously the Jungian shadow aspect and Richard Schwartz, IFS, just really embracing these parts that have their way. I just love that you started by sharing that. That's amazing. You speak a lot. I'm just going to start in an area that I didn't intend to, but you've spoken a lot about how temperament and sensitivity. I don't know if you know Elaine Aron, the idea of a highly sensitive person, either high.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. So she, the idea of a sensitive person being more susceptible to addiction is a really big topic, and I love that you touched on it. I think more recently in one of your transcribed talks.
Mm.
But just to start with the one of the many areas we can dive into with you is around addiction. And one thing that has touched me the most about your work is that I have directly experienced recovery around addiction, certainly denial around addiction, the actings out of addiction, the negative and consequential effects of addiction, particularly around work, food, love, big time in the love addiction recovery, and then shopping sometimes too, and just consumption in the past. But basically, what you have shared in many different ways is this approach, whether it's through the idea of the war, the quote unquote war on drugs, this whole punitive perception of junkies and drug addicts, and this idea that on some level, those who quote unquote are not addicted, or perhaps don't know they're addicted, having that sort of better than, worse than thing with addicts to the point where they're relegated, punished, put in jail, shamed, blamed. There's just a huge punitive energy in general around addicts. And you're coming at this whole conversation from a place of really acknowledging that there needs to be compassion and empathy and understanding that addictive behavior is not actually a choice.
All right. So can I begin with what you raised about sensitivity?
Yes, of
Okay.
course.
I heard much of your compelling interview with Dan Siegel. Dan has been one of the influences on my own awareness of the way things are, going way back.
Yeah.
But he talked about some genetic, what can I say, predispositions.
Yeah.
Now, what I believe actually is that the commonest genetic predisposition, if you're going to talk about addictions, is actually sensitivity.
God bless you.
And sensitivity actually means, it's from the Latin word sensere, to feel. So it simply means that the sensitive person feels everything more. So for the sensitive person, less has to happen for them to feel more compared to the other person. So if there's a little bit of pain to the sensitive person,
it's excruciating.
It's excruciating. Yes. And if there's a lot of pain, it becomes absolutely unbearable.
Like dissociative.
Or you have to escape from it somehow. And so the addiction really is an escape from pain. Now, the more sensitive you are, the more pain you're going to have, depending on what happens to you, and the more you need to escape. And this actually, by the way, also explains why so many artists and creative people have addictive problems, because it's that same sensitivity that makes them into artists.
Exactly.
So that both the creativity and the ability to interpret the world, the genius, and the dysfunction that comes from defending against the pain, they both arise from that sensitivity.
Yes.
To which I think there's probably a strong genetic component, but that doesn't mean that there's any genes that cause addiction.
It's the epigenetics and the predisposition, and then you've mentioned it very clearly, and Elaine Aron has too, the idea that if a highly sensitive temperament, which according to Elaine is 20% on average of people and animals, I even think plants might need to be thrown in there, orchids, etc. But I think of, you mentioned John Lennon in a few of your talks. I think about Kurt Cobain. I think
Yeah.
about a lot of artists who perhaps have the sensitivity temperament, but not given any kind of a handbook. Well, now there is one with Elaine and your teachings and mine as well in different ways, but there hasn't been ways or a handbook as such to support a sensitive artist who's quote unquote contributing so much to the world, how to navigate their personal life of extreme emotion and how to navigate the overwhelm and the overstimulation that can happen just day-to-day living, let alone the re-traumatizing effect of being in the public eye. I mean, there's an instant relational disconnect.
And John Lennon, he's got this very raw song called Working Class Hero, where he says, I forget, you might remember the words exactly, I don't, but it's something about they torture and hurt you for 20 odd years, then they expect you to pick a career.
Right.
And,
nice.
and he was talking about his own sensitive soul that suffered so much. Now, to bring this back to the war on drugs, then this actually means that the war on drugs is very often waged against the most vulnerable people in our society.
The people who need the most support, basically.
Who need the most support. Not to mention, of course, there's a huge racial angle to it as well,
and
especially
cultural
in Canada,
and economic and
culture. In Canada and United States, both. But really, what it comes down to is that the more sensitive you are, the more you suffer. The more you suffer, the more you need to escape. And the more you escape, you might go to addictions, and then you get punished for it. So basically,
you can't win.
We're punishing people for being sensitive and being hurt.
Amen.
That's what we're punishing people.
Exactly. Yeah. And doing whatever we can. And I will throw myself into this category because I have been judged and shamed for various ways that I've done to self-soothe or self-medicate or whatever it is. It's an attempt to regulate in a way. I mean, if there's any self-medicating going on through various addictions on a personal level for me, my motivation is pure. I would like to regulate. I would like to be able to sort of moderate incoming phenomena without having to become overwhelmed. But as a sensitive temperament, a sensitive soul, everything feels heightened. Everything feels extreme in the body, So for me, the greater share of my work has been about learning to self-regulate, come up with 13 different resources and ways for me to somatically become more embodied, because the escape you speak of was so easy to be done through, disassociation and just checking out of my body, So the Peter Levine somatic experiencing work has been so profound. And I love how you speak about trauma and addiction being inextricably linked, because it's so obvious. And then you're bringing in the conversation around sensitivity and the susceptibility of it. And I think it's important to note that the susceptibility can work in the opposite direction too. If a sensitive creature who might be susceptible is in an environment of profound nurturing and warmth and connectivity and attunement and mirroring and holding and appropriate affirmation and guidance and all these wonderfully nurturing aspects, they actually can thrive triple-fold from my experience.
Well, let me tell you about a study that was done either in Australia or in New Zealand, just about what you're talking about now. They looked at a population for aggressivity. And the people that were most aggressive had a certain kind of genetic variation. But interestingly enough, so did the people that were the least aggressive. So what the most and the least aggressive shared was this genetic variation. So how do you explain? So clearly the gene couldn't have been for aggression. Otherwise,
we'd all be punching each other.
So then you looked at their childhoods. The non-aggressive one, the peaceful ones, had precisely the childhoods that you just described. And the aggressive ones had been in homes where they'd been hurt. And all that means is, in both cases, it's the same kind of temperament, sensitive to exactly to the environment. And so, yes, the other side of it is that nurtured and honored and respected and recognized and given the right conditions, that sensitive person would just be a creative bloom on this earth. They will not necessarily be addicted at all.
Yes, and I actually feel as though I've had an experience with both. I've had environments where, the neglect or the quote unquote abuse in the multiple forms that can show up in, I atrophied. I just collapsed and contracted, and then the neuroplasticity of how things can change. This isn't a dire, long-term, nothing can change kind of thing. When I am thrown into an environment with relationally, I'll call them relationally masterful sort of functional dynamics, I flourish and I thrive, and it doesn't really actually take that long, so.
It's only that I'm remarking on a phrase that you used. You said, when I'm thrown into an environment. How about when you choose an environment?
I choose them, but my poor temperament, and I say poor temperament in quotes, my temperament often feels like I am just, responding to the vicissitudes and waves of a crazy ocean. But that's simply because the internal experience in my body, I have to be prepared for the fact that there's some extremes in that. And like you mentioned earlier, gifts are that the art becomes what it is. The aesthetic perception of a photograph can be, the attunement to subtlety can be so finessed that it's a sacred experience. And creating art has truly saved my life on multiple occasions.
My wife's an artist, and when she looks at a flower or a painting or anything, she sees something other than what I see, with her eyes. That she sees so much more.
Yes.
Just because she's got that kind of sensitivity.
Yes.
I have sensitivity, but not in that visual sense.
You mean like temperamentally? Do you think are you a sensitive? Do you know?
Well, you know what? It's interesting. I never thought about it much. Now that you
can take the test from Elaine Aaron if you want.
I have to think I must be, because I pick up on so much in my environment. I sense so many things.
You do. And I don't know you well, so sometimes I can weigh in and have an opinion, but because I don't know you, I'd have to ask you. But yeah, the beauty of that, and I think Elaine talks about highly sensitive walks into a room, or sorry, I'll reverse that. A non-sensitive, and I don't mean not sensitive, I mean temperamentally not sensitive, walks into a room and picks up on 50 pieces of information. And a sensitive walks in the room and picks up on 500 pieces of information. So it makes sense that the sensitive temperament will be easily overwhelmed and have a susceptibility and a tendency toward addictive behaviors, because ultimately we're seeking relief and sustainability. Like for me, naive or in denial or whatever, I just want something that will create sustainability to my participation and service in the world, so we are susceptible.
Well, in that sense, I'm not sensitive. I'm not like that. I'm not one of those people. So I'll have to take myself out of that.
Well,
category.
we'll do some tests
later. But what you're pointing to is essential, because what you're pointing to is that addictions are really all about trying to regulate the internal environment, which is for some reason overwhelming or unbearable or painful. That's what addictions are all about, and that's why I reject this whole disease model of the addiction.
Right.
Because addiction doesn't start off as a disease.
No.
It begins as pain.
And solace craving. Yeah. And attachment hunger and all the, and then of course, and you mentioned this a lot in your work. I mean, of course it affects the brain. Long-term use of any substance of any kind will play with the brain shape and the neurons and everything, but it's not born from that, is what you're saying.
Well, it was from Dan Siegel and Alan Shore, who's a psychologist and also in LA, actually.
Yeah, I love him.
From whom I learned, I think over 20 years ago now, that the brain develops an interaction with the environment. And so that the physiology of the brain and the neurochemistry of the brain don't develop purely according to genetic patterns, but are very much influenced by the quality of interpersonal relationships in the early years.
Yes.
And so that when we talk about the addicted brain, yes, there's biology there, but that biology is a reflection of a life and life experiences. And the good news is, as you suggested before, the neuroplasticity. Since that is the case, then we can, if you see addiction or any mental health issue really as a developmental problem, as saying that the conditions for healthy development were not correct, but knowing that the brain can develop new circuits and self-regulation and so on, even later on in life, what conditions do we need to give people so they can develop along the right lines at any age?
And the ideal conditions of recovery, or include things like support and community, and to speak to what you just said. I remember having I had a home birth with both my children, and after the first one, I had a lot of empathy for the billions of women around the planet having babies, past, present, and future. And I said to a doula I was working with, I said, what about those of us who had a birth plan and it didn't work out? And, what does that do with the whole attachment journey? Because I am aware of the fact that in utero, and frankly, even beforehand, the development of the brain and the body is affected by the state of the mom and the hormones coursing through her body and etc. And the sweet answer she gave was, nothing love can't heal. Nothing love can. Right. And so I just thought, wow, okay, so God bless neuroplasticity. God bless that our circumstance and our environment and our social context can reaffirm it. And I think because of the autonomy movement that was going on for such a long time after the First and Second World War, I think people just went into this autonomy movement of, I can do it all. I don't need anybody else. And certainly that may have afforded, in the feminist context of the feminist movement, it may have afforded some sort of agency or sense of competence in terms of the rugged individualism you speak about. But it also, it didn't create connectivity and intimacy and interrelational mirror neuron love, warmth, regulation, embryonic feeling. It just created this sense of competence, which is a lovely area of development that's important, but it doesn't include the general endorphin inducing and dopamine inducing, oxytocin inducing bliss that can come from having the attachment needs generally met.
If you look at the gender ratio of multiple sclerosis in the 1930s and early 40s, I think, in Canada at least, and I think it was close in the States as well, it was 1-to-1. So one male for every female. Okay. You know what the gender ratio now is?
I'm scared. No.
About 3.5 women for every man. Mm. So something has happened. Now, I don't want to lay what has happened at the doors of feminism, because feminism was an important, progressive, and continues to be an essential movement.
Yeah.
But what has happened historically is that women have always carried the stresses of their families and their spouses. That's just the culturally assigned role.
Yes, and also when probably biochemically also I think
the oxytocin and the child and the child caring. That's right, all that. So now that they're out there also playing an economic role, but the emotional role has not been shared. They're still carrying it.
I know. And can I tell you what else we're sharing? And this happened with Alan Shore.
No, but let me just finish this out, though, because there's a third part to it, which refers to what you said about connectivity. Mm-hmm. And so that on the one hand, now you have double the load of stress and responsibility, but with less support, because as you pointed out, there's less connectivity now.
Yes, no villages.
And there's no villages. So now you have more stress, less support. Of course, you're going to have the skewed gender ratio. And so there's a price to be paid for all this in a sense of in the cost of health and so on.
Yeah, and where a big piece of that is for me endocrinology. Like in the hormone world, if I'm trying, there's some theories, whether they're sort of empirically validated or not. There's some theories around, if a woman body, where we are in this sort of feminist, humanist, holism movement, if the woman body is trying to do what is sort of stereotypically done by the sort of masculine hunter-gatherer, role and archetype, I think about it often because I consider myself an alpha female, very feminine, very masculine, call upon it whenever I need either qualities. Often it's just both and both sides of the brain. I'm a Gemini. But the taxing, the stress of taking on all these archetypal roles that typically would have been shared in a village. I'm in certain isolated environments, I'm trying to be the aunts, the 6 aunts, the 6 uncles, the 4 grandparents, the visiting village friends, I'm trying to be 93 people to certainly my children and my family. And I've bent over backwards to try and create a sense of village and community and connectivity where we can lean on each other. Because and I think our bodies are suffering for it, and one of the biggest indicators certainly is through hormone movement, and a lot of the illnesses in your book. The body says no. I mean, I just love how you correlate and link a certain sort of a psychosocial approach to life and our adaptive sort of or maladaptive in moments survival strategies that may have served us when we were 6 or 3 by sublimating our authentic selves so that we can get our needs met by our parents or caregivers.
Well, sorry, just to complete, I just don't want to be misunderstood on feminism. So I'm not suggesting that women should or ought to give up their economic, social, political roles. I'm suggesting there needs to be a sharing of the first responsibility. There needs to be a sharing of the caring, and that's what hasn't happened.
Yes, and that's incumbent upon the sort of masculine. I mean, if patriarchy is disempowered masculine, then the invitation is to invite in a modernized version of empowered masculine, whereby the provisions that they, the proverbial vegan bacon that is brought home, or the provide and protect, the sort of long-standing, what does a man provide? So the currency of what they provide is different in modern times. So sharing of the caring is actually a huge masculine provision if it's seen from that place.
And when men do it, it changes them biologically. It actually changes their brains.
And the thing that was said about that for a while was, we don't want, a lot of men themselves were like, my testosterone's going down. Like, I don't want to be emasculated. And there's all these words that have sort of attempted to thwart that movement. But what I think is that if the man, hetero usually, but any man body can really embrace the fact that it's just contextually, culturally, where the feminist movement and otherwise, where the losing of the patriarchy movement is moving, if it can be framed that this is still a provision. In fact, it's huge. If women are taking on in their bodies both sides all the time, men are invited to do the same. And there were some comments over the years about people saying that that's not a good thing for the man body. But the problem is that we've gotten to where we've gotten culturally, right? So everyone does have to kind of become wholeified in a way in order to make this work long term for our bodies. Because and you say it so beautifully, and The Body Says No, and a lot of your talks around it, that there are certain approaches and coping strategies to life that can pre-indicate either cancer or autoimmune challenges, or the tendency to overgive, the tendency to take on too much and live in sort of a chronic re-traumatizing state of stress, so.
Well, you know what is the saddest song I know? I often play this at my seminars. It's by Elvis Presley. He sings it.
Yeah.
And it's, any way you want me, that's how I'll be. I'll be strong as a mountain or weak as a willow tree. Any way you want me, that's how I'll be. In other words, this pressure on children.
Yes.
Not to be themselves.
Yes.
But to fit into the environment in a way that they'll be accepted and loved, not for who they are, but for what they provide and the way they show up. It's such a tragic dilemma for so many people.
Yes, and it's the conditions upon which addiction and all of those thrive. It's like, I just see this sublimation of the authentic self. And you said it in one of your books. You mentioned the idea that so many of us have to go through this tunnel of a sort of having sublimated self, creating a false self, or whatever word we want to use, in order to attempt to adorably, in a sacred way, manipulate getting one's needs met and staying alive, frankly. And then later the effects of that certainly on our adult relationships, but on our bodies, and
because that way of being of getting disconnected from ourselves. And of course, I know you've had Peter Levine on your show, and he's another one of my good colleagues and teachers as well. And Peter points out that the essence of trauma is the disconnection from the self.
Yes.
And so we get disconnected from ourselves, and then we have to make up for that emptiness for the rest of our lives by taking on this persona or that persona, or this role or that role. And you mentioned the workaholism before. Well, the workaholism is simply an attempt. At least if I can speak of my own experience of workaholism, which has been a powerful drive in my life, and it's something I continue to need to deal with. In fact, this is something I mentioned. My wife actually last year said to me, "You've written a book called When the Body Says No. You better write one. Say
when your wife says." You're like, that's my next one. By the way, Brian Robinson has single-handedly supported me out of my own work addiction. I'm still in recovery. I'm by no means on any sort of other side at this point, but I feel like he's a very powerful voice in really breaking down that the roots of work addiction start literally when we're pre-verbal, right? It's like they're all planted there.
Literally, listen, recently I was speaking in Norway. I was giving a talk at a conference, but there were some Norwegian psychotherapists who are friends of mine, and they do a certain kind of therapy, which she actually is going to bring to LA in February, but I'm not going to go into the details of it, except they said, well, how would you like to have a session with us? Finally, said, what came up through the resonance of other people that picked up the energies within me is that my mother didn't want me. Now, it's not that she didn't want me as such. It's that under the conditions of Nazi occupation and Jews under the threat of the genocide, she really would have had mixed feelings about bringing a child into the world.
Of course.
And I would pick up on that in utero.
Of course.
And so
Yes.
my workaholism, of course, is one way to compensate for that.
Yes.
Because, as I've said in my talk sometimes, if you want to be wanted, go to medical school. Because
you'll be needed.
Because you'll be needed, which is not the same as being wanted.
Or loved.
But it's the next best thing.
Right.
Or loved, but it's the next best. And precisely the reason it's addictive, because it's never enough. So you have to keep having more and more and more.
Right.
Because the love and the wanted still isn't there. And so Dr. Vincent Felitti, who's a wonderful researcher and physician in San Diego, said that it's hard to get enough of something that almost works. So the workaholism momentarily makes you feel that you want it and appreciate it, which of course you are for what you're providing. But the inner self, the true self says, well, they don't even know me. They don't even see me. They don't want me. They just want what I can do for them.
Yes.
And so it's never enough.
And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if that's where we're coming from, we'll have that corroborated circumstantially time and again, because it's our story, and it's a valid story born from circumstances. I totally understand it. But the work addiction one, to me, is also just that tendency toward, and some of it is the sensitivity, susceptibility, but some of it is just a survival strategy approach that gets compounded over the years of over-giving, over-deferring, over-empathizing. It's just this hyper version of what might be a moderate contribution. It just goes to the whole other level, because in some ways I always felt that I had to meet people. I'll meet you 90% and you can meet me 10 if you feel like it, And so just my tendency to look at over generosity or over servicefulness or whatever it is, it's all under that umbrella of work addiction. And it just makes sense.
Yes, well, it's a hypertrophy. It's a hypertrophy of a real part of yourself.
Yes,
but it's a hypertrophy. It's an overgrowth of it. It's an over muscularity of it.
And it becomes hard to treat, I would imagine, too. It certainly has been in my case, because a lot of the feedback would be, "Well, you're generous, Alanis." And I was like, "I'm generous."
You get.
Wait, I'm generous, but but this is extreme. Like, this is to the point. You talk about addiction, any behavior that gives you temporary relief, temporary pleasure, but in the long term causes harm and negative consequences, and you can't give it up despite those negative consequences. So, work addiction. If we just focus on that one for a hot second. The consequences of chronic cortisol. You spoke about in one of your books about how a lot of kids are given cortisol and stress-inducing hormones in order to address asthma and certain chronic conditions, because, and I think Peter Levine talks about this maybe, where the cortisol is so chronically high to the point of it being, in my opinion, traumatizing, and that at some point tell me. You're the doctor.
Dan Siegel, I was listening to your Dan Siegel podcast, and he mentioned this. The cortisol in the short term,
it goes down.
But chronically elevated, it'll make you sick. And
it goes down, right? So they'll test you for cortisol levels, and they'll be precipitously low. But that's not because the person has low stress. It's because the mechanism, you would have better words for this, but somehow the mechanism shuts down.
The mechanism is exhausted.
Yes.
The mechanism is exhausted.
Yes.
And so now we have to give people extra stress hormones just to keep their bodies going. And this is true not just for children. If you actually look at cortisol or steroids, they're the commonest medication, whether you go to a lung specialist or a gut specialist or a dermatologist or a rheumatologist.
For anti-inflammation or?
It's anti-inflammatory, but it's really is the stress hormone. And so the question we as physicians ought to be asking ourselves is, if we're having to treat so many conditions with stress hormone, could stress have something to do with the onset of these conditions? And why aren't we looking at that? It's such a simple question.
It is, and it's so valid, because especially with this information of how cortisol drops when it's been chronically maxed out in the red for too long, because it can be misleading. If someone takes those tests and they find their levels are low, they'll think, "Oh, my stress levels are low," but it's just shut down at this point.
But in the meanwhile, the elevated cortisol levels will ulcerate your intestines, thin your bones, make you depressed, put unhealthy fat on your belly in a way that predisposed to heart disease, and it can also even suppress the immune system.
Yes,
this is chronically elevated levels of cortisol. So this game of I shouldn't call it a game.
situation.
This situation of getting the mind body unity, and how about our emotions and our emotional makeup and the stories we had to tell ourselves as children
Mm-hmm.
in order to survive. Those same stories are now keeping us in prison,
Yes.
and within our own bodies. Really,
Mm-hmm.
it's just such an essential conversation.
Yes, and then in terms of addressing, well, there's a few aspects to this. So the universal addiction process, from what I've grokked over having been a student and a mentee of yours, whether you knew it or not, the spiritual emptiness, the emotional pain, we can dissect these in a second, the disconnection from self, the need for escape, the focus on the external. The process itself becomes a furthering of the attachment hunger and these developmental needs that were not met. It's just we walk around with this hunger, and the process itself of operating from this emptiness. And I think the emptiness can also be born from having been raised by caregiving environment where there's narcissism, and you as a small human being are just part of the narcissistic supply or the appendage to the narcissistic caregivers. That creates, I've heard the hole in the soul, like that just creates this deep emptiness. And I want to dissect the idea of emptiness with you, because I feel like that is part of the process of moving toward solution and moving toward that which could correct some of this and repair this deep cultural planetary wound that is so pervasive now, to the point where it's, culturally it can be, the numbers I'm assuming are different everywhere, but there's a continuity between suffering amongst human beings, regardless of race, regardless of culture, regardless of economics. I mean, it's the straight up human condition of, we have our developmental needs and tasks that we would ideally meet from the good enough parenting situation. And if it's not met, then we walk around with this hunger and this hole. So also partly contributed by not being mirrored accurately. As a young person, I had a lot of mirroring around being prodigious and around being a writer, and didn't have mirroring in these all these other areas that are just sort of day-to-day human, whether it's strength or whether it's the capacity for intellectual. I didn't even know I was smart. I mean, some might contest that. I think I figured out that I was smart from a therapist in my 30s. I had no idea. And so much of the lack of mirroring and reflection toward young children.
Funny you should say that, because when I was talking to your producer, I don't know if I said this to him, but after I listened to your podcast, a few of your podcasts, I thought, this woman is fearsomely intelligent. It's kind of intimidating to even talk to her, because you come so well prepared but intellectually well prepared, extraordinarily so. But of course, you've also done your inner work.
Yes.
So you've got this combination of inner work coupled with a really prodigious intelligence. It's not your average interview, let me tell you.
Oh, bless. It's I feel like I have to pinch myself sometimes even having this conversation with you, because even though I've sort of archetypally known as a musician, certainly I am, and an artist and a writer and a performer, I just feel like this was always my back pocket secret, this propensity toward understanding the human condition from science and brain, somatic, art, movement, and all the systems, endocrine system, etheric, all of it. We're such gorgeously simple and wildly complex creatures. I think we overly complicate what we are in so many ways, and then I think we underestimate and underdiagnose, maybe overdiagnose, frankly. I just feel like there's a way to master this funny little human experience. But I think you've said this in various ways over the years, looking toward the solution, whether, people think that, the Band-Aid of, it's a war on drugs, we'll just spend a shit ton of money putting people in jail, punishing them, shaming them, instead of putting money toward understanding the human condition, educating people, elucidating the idea of developmentalism and what tasks that ideally we would kind of check off on the box as we go along. It's cumulative. And then the sacredness of whether it's the Imago process or John Gottman and Julie, just talking about how to correct Sue Johnson, to correct attachment in adult relationships. So there's hope, there's ways to do this, but if the onus and the focus were to be put on what's really going on underneath all this, then some of the focus could be taken off of the completely useless process of the war on drugs. It's like, that punishment doesn't work. The war on
Well,
drugs is not working. Addictions haven't stopped.
So let's make a different assumption.
Okay.
Let's make the assumption that the war on drugs is working.
Okay.
So, for example, if you ask the question, was the Iraq War a success or failure? That depends very much on what you assume the purpose of it was.
Right.
If the purpose of it was to stop terrorism, so-called, or really terrorism, it was a total and utter failure.
Yes.
But what if the purpose was to make a lot of money for the arms manufacturers,
then it was
and to enhance the power of the U.S. military? Well, then it was a major success.
So
I'm saying the same thing. I'm saying the same thing with the war on drugs as well. Is that part of its tenacity is not just lack of understanding of addiction, but actually the fact that it works for a lot of people. If you're a corporation that runs for-profit jails in the U.S.,
oh, right, got it.
You love the war on drugs. If you're a police force that wants more weapons and more money thrown at you, you love the war on drugs.
Right.
If you're prosecutors and legal establishment that spend so much of its time prosecuting these sensitive, traumatized people, you love the war on drugs.
Right.
If you're a politician that finds easy votes in being down on the junkies and being tough on crime, you love the war on drugs.
Right.
And so again, it's working. That's one of the main problems with it. Now, the other problem, of course, is that if you take its premises at face value, which is to end drug use and to deal with addiction, of course, it's a complete and utter failure.
Yeah, people will find it.
But as I've said before, what it really is, and Bessel van der Kolk, who's a trauma psychiatrist, who's written a wonderful book called "The Body Keeps the Score." He said at one point, 95% of the people in the jails of the U.S. are traumatized children.
No question. I would even maybe say 100. Unless there was some mistake made, or whoops, I tripped and fell and robbed the bank. What I love, and it's probably controversial. I don't even care. I think it's so brave and awesome. The idea of creating supervised injection places and harm reduction facilities, and really sitting next to the addict empathically, as opposed to standing across from them punitively. I mean, this is straight up parenting 101 too, right? If you want to influence, you want to come as their partner in crime, pardon the pun.
So let me come back to the supervised injection site in a moment. I just, something just leapt back into my mind that was there before, and then I lost track of it, which is that when you were talking about your own struggle to recognize your own intelligence, I had the opposite struggle, which is to be accepted. I had to dampen it down.
Right.
In other words, I couldn't share my insights, and because I could see stuff and I could recognize stuff that other people just didn't.
Yeah.
But how do you fit in if now? Fortunately, the part of me that demanded self-expression
was fierce enough.
was fierce enough, But I understand that struggle from both sides.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of supervised injection sites, well, let me ask you what your thoughts are first.
First of all, I think that some people stopping, and I love the 12 steps for those people who have been benefited by it, millions and millions and millions of people. It can't be knocked in that way. Esther Hicks has come up with, the 12 steps that is maybe imbued with her and Abraham's personal take on the soulfulness and the sense of spirit and the connection with source that just permeates all 12 steps, So I love the reinterpretations, right. Buddhist reinterpretations, my own personal reinterpretations of the 12 steps. Then for me, that's one important step in the process. And some people do 12 steps, and it allows them to stop and have a sense of community and have a sense of connection with people in their community who are on a similar path. And then some people participate in it, and there's no, there may be no trauma recovery work. So in some ways, it's almost as though there's a pause button that's been pressed. So the traumas themselves, the sediment on the bottom of the water or the ocean is still there, but it might come up once in a while. But the stopping is, in so many ways, the step one. And then the invitation ultimately is to really look at the childhood trauma and and work through it. And there's tons of resources for that, a lot of which I can share on the website around this podcast.
So far, I've agreed with everything you've said, and for those people that are able to take that abstinence step, that's totally great, and the 12 steps are wonderful.
Actually. Yeah.
But there's no one size fits all.
No.
And some people at a certain point just are not ready to do that, and the question is now, Should they be injecting with puddle water in the back alleys of
With
of
great
Vancouver down
shame, right?
Sunnyside,
Yeah. No.
or and sharing HIV infected needles with one another,
Yep.
or should they have a safe, clean place to inject
Yes.
with sterile water and clean needles,
And
and they get
relationality, right? I'm assuming there's a human being in the room, eye contact and empathy, I would hope.
That's the biggest part of it.
Yes.
That's the biggest part of it, and so that all of a sudden they're accepted for who they are for the first time in their lives. And if they happen to be people who at this point in their lives have to inject in
So,
order to feel okay about themselves,
yes.
so be it.
Yes.
But let them do so in a condition of relative safety.
Yes.
Where
some
they're not going to
companionship.
endanger.
Yes. And the big concept within 12 steps of, sharing secrets and alleviating shame by sharing with another. I mean, first of all, the epicenter of recovery for me is relational. And you've mentioned it in various ways. Dan, of course, does, and a lot of my mentors do as well. So relational. And then the idea of, I mean, this is, to me, it likely is perceived as leading edge, probably because of how terrifying and risky and how much faith and trust in life and God and humans that is required to offer these supervised injection sites and harm reduction facilities, because it presupposes that human beings are innately good. The one thing that's not subject to duality, that, there is innate goodness in your very existence as a snowflake is unique and untouchable in terms of its innate worth. But doing this way, it's not unlike, this sort of small part of the bell-shaped curve in education, like unschooling. I feel as though there's a profound amount of faith and trust and belief in the human being that is required to do anything that is considered so-called alternative, So in this case of the supervised sort of empathic environments where someone can do what they're going to be doing anyway, but in a no shame around it, hopefully. And
well, you raised two important points. Yes, there is a faith in the human being. In other words, you trust that in that person, you don't have to cure them.
No.
In them, there's a healing process.
Yes.
And of course, medical training doesn't prepare us to respect that healing process inside the individual. It's all about what we can do for people or to people, know, and we can do a lot of great things.
Certainly.
But missing is this faith or this knowledge that human beings, as all creatures, have this healing capacity, and part of our job is to create the right conditions for healing.
Yes.
Now, as you said, in a supervised injection site, there's an important relational component. Now, since people were hurt in relationship in the first place, they're going to heal in relationship in the second place.
Yes.
So harm reduction is not simply a question of clean needles. It's also about providing that relationship.
Yes.
And as far as what you said about schooling, if we really had faith in human nature and in children,
which I do,
we wouldn't be bombarding them with rules and regulations and information.
I agree.
We'd be inviting their unfoldment.
Yes.
As human beings. And Gordon Neufeld, my colleague and co-writer who you talked to recently, speaks so eloquently about the developmental agenda. Is the agenda of nature for each of us is that we should realize our fullest potential.
Yes.
And again, the question is, under what conditions will that happen, and under what conditions is that inhibited? And unfortunately, teachers and physicians and healthcare workers in general and nobody is taught along those lines.
Well, so even the word taught, like the word you use, taught, in some ways, I mean, whether it's in the recovery movement, whether it's sort of the relational aspect of these environments where people can be loved and monitored through what they'll be doing anyway. The word taught implies that there's something about the human being that has to be manipulated and imposed, as opposed to, and you've said this in different ways too, as opposed to removing any blocks from the perception of self, authentic self, so removing the blocks and the maladaptive behaviors that may have kept us alive, certainly when we were younger, but now it's causing us to insulate, isolate, sublimate, disconnect, suffer, so to open those up, it's less about manipulating or fixing or tough loving someone into a behavior change, and more about removing that which is there that keeps them in the illusion of their innate badness and their innate core shame, so
You're quite right. These are not formal teachings. They're actually processes that need to be supported or could be subverted. When I use the word taught, I just meant in their formal education of physicians
Yes.
and teachers.
Yes.
Uh,
And the
there's no
indoctrination
sense.
sorry.
The indoctrination, that's a good phrase, the indoctrination of doctors.
Yes, it
You
is.
know,
The doc of the
it's,
doc.
many physicians will actually tell you how traumatizing it is to go to medical school.
Yes. And Dan talks
And,
about
the,
that too.
yeah, and then these well, Dan and I've talked about that,
Yeah.
and how nothing in that environment supports one's spontaneous unfoldment and growth.
Of self.
In
Of
fact,
yeah.
yeah. So then these people who are then, first of all, they were probably driven people like me who had to become doctors for some inner reason to compensate for something, in addition to the commitment to human life and easing of suffering and gaining the
Yes.
skills. There's also that self part, that's not satisfied.
Yes.
So you have these people who are very motivated, very driven, and then they go through this situation which is highly restricted, highly regulated, and for many people highly traumatizing. And then they're supposed to go out there and heal people.
Yeah. It's like we'll abuse the people who are going to go help, quote unquote, help other people. Yeah, it's
If you look at a lot of healthcare systems and how stressed the people are in them,
yeah.
and these stressed people are not supposed to help stressed humanity from a position of being stressed themselves.
And they can't.
I also wanted to come back to something you said about 12 steps, though, is what I really wish for the 12-step movement. The 12 steps, as you said, are great. And I mean, they're not just great for alcoholics or addicts. They're great for everybody.
Every day. Yep.
But missing from their perspective is dealing with the trauma that instigated the behavior in the first place. And Bill W., the founder of AA, this is what's so strange about it, or so maybe not so strange. He was an abandoned child. He was a highly traumatized human being.
Yeah.
They never talk about that.
Yeah.
Or if they talk about, or at least it's not part of the programming. I know in some groups here and there that may come up, but usually it's more about the behavior and the so-called disease of addiction than about the underlying trauma that's driving it.
Yes, and the idea of being trauma informed in all these different contexts, whether it's trauma informed yoga, when I teach in workshop contexts, the old kind of approach, whether it's Fritz Perls or whether is that kind of confrontational, I'm going to knock this out of the not Irvion, he's amazing, Primal Scream, like a lot of it was,
Arthur Janov.
Yes, parts of that as well. Just kind of
he's the one, by the way, that John Lennon saw.
That's how I heard of him, actually.
Yeah.
But the idea of confrontation or tough love, there's so many words that kind of connote this, I'm going to knock it out of you, or I'm going to, you aren't listening, you're not changing your addictive behavior, so I'm just going to be tough with you. Yeah. It's like so counterproductive, first of all. But the idea too that
when people talk to me about tough love, I say there's no such thing as tough love. There's either love or there's
exactly. Tough love is an oxymoron. And so when I would teaching now, these terms are synonymous, but the idea of being empathic is trauma informed because, whether it's Peter Levine or Bessel van der Kolk, Babette Rothschild, like really coming at it from this empathic inside out, I'm with you, relational connectivity, mirror neurons. It's what we were born to do, is to do this together, So I'm actually really excited about this movement toward relationality as the epicenter of healing. And I see it happening.
It's great. It's great. And it's great. And there's so many more forms of therapy that are being developed based on that principle. And you mentioned Sue Johnson and a bunch of other people as well.
Yeah.
What the phrase trauma informed brings up for me, though, is it's kind of it's almost hilarious. Some institutions are now telling the public that they're trauma informed, which is a good thing.
If they are, it's good.
If they are, but I think what should be required is that every other place should put up a sign saying we're trauma uninformed.
Yes, nice.
Like what does it mean that to be trauma informed? It just means that you're aware of reality.
You know what's going on, right? What actually is going on.
That's all. You're not trauma informed. You're reality informed.
Yes, but unfortunately, we're in a context where it's these tools and these provisions for healing, quote unquote, have been kind of bereft. I mean, there's not enough information. There's not enough holistic resources to approach a human being from the multitudinous, like I said earlier, this gorgeously complex aspect of what it is to be whole. I mean, the developmental process itself, and I love what Gordon Neufeld did with his own version of it. I I love the developmentalism.
Yeah. Yeah.
The idea is that there are certain things we need. Maslow's hierarchy, whatever. There are certain things we need, and if we don't get
That's
them,
right.
and you speak about, the needs are for attachment and a need for authentic self or authentic self-expression. I mean, that's
Right.
that's no light comment, and that they affect each other. So if attachment is going to be threatened, the idea of living authentically from essential self will begin to be sublimated and sort of pretzeled the behavior in the self into something that could be loved.
Being the authentic self will actually be frightening.
Yes.
Because if you learned early that only by being authentic can you survive and be accepted and loved,
Right.
then that becomes part of your persona, and you
Yes.
believe that's you.
Yes.
And so when it comes to authenticity, you're actually going to be afraid of it.
Yes.
Because at some point it threatened your survival.
Yes.
So we actually become our own enemies, and this is also, I think, how the immune system becomes our enemy in autoimmune diseases. It's based on that dynamic.
Yes.
So these are these early patterns and these early core beliefs that we develop about ourselves, and are actually, as Alice Miller put it, they're prisons. Her book, The Drama of the Gifted Child, the German title was Prisoners of Childhood. I'm 74 now, and I'm still finding myself having to remove these core beliefs or to challenge them, or to find out if I go with the internal family systems model, which part of me holds on to them still, and what it takes for that part to release that core belief. This is ongoing work, and you know what? It's a beautiful work too. So
it's beautiful, but it's there's the sadness that I have knowing, because I often ask that to myself and others, like, is this, am I always going to be in therapy nonstop, removing false thoughts, using the 700 ways that I can figure out how to be in the truth and the reality of what it is to be here in this body and define self when there's an amorphous sense of self that, it's like. And the answer that I've come up with, and please tell me what your experience is that yes, in my particular case, yes, I would likely go to the grave doing therapy.
Well, speaking of the grave, speaking of the grave, I've often said this. I don't know if I said it publicly, but I've written my own epitaph.
Yes, and what is
it? And on my gravestone, it's going to be carved. It was a lot more work than I had anticipated.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. We might need to make t-shirts.
No, but having said that,
it's a lot more work.
having said that,
yes.
No, the answer is not that somebody needs to be in therapy all their lives.
What is the answer, Gabor? Because, I mean, it depends on how wounded, I guess, too, and it depends on the extreme of it. Like for me, the sense of self. I mean, so much of my mission, my Star of Bethlehem, has so often been defining self, or having a sense of these aspects of self because they were mirrored accurately, and then having, as Harville Hendrix talked about, like lost, hidden, denied parts. Richard Schwartz talked about it too, like having all these parts that have sort of, they've been dormant, or they've been relegated, or they've been completely cut off to the point where they're even outside of my awareness. I mean, the journey of wholeness, returning to wholeness, not creating some wholeness, but returning to it, is such a sacred journey to me. And, I don't know if it's cynical to say, but I'm not sure there will be a time where I feel like I've arrived as such. I don't know. Maybe. If I do, I'll call you.
Well, all I'm saying is don't prejudge it, because
be open.
Don't presume that it's going to have to be just a tough struggle and so on, because I can tell you from my purge as a 74-year-old,
Yes, please. I'm all ears.
Well, I'm glad I'm not as troubled and conflicted as I was at the stupid young age of 71. So
you were a young buck.
I know, a young buck. Yeah, I'm still a promising young man.
We have a big future ahead of you.
But I'm serious about that. So that really I've learned. I know that I'm so much. There is that essence. There's that core self, which the spiritual masters teach and embody. And I don't claim to be one of those people at all. But I can tell you, I'm much closer to myself. I feel that, and at times, I really do feel myself. I really do.
And can
And
I ask you a
so,
question that's a little specific? I don't.
yeah,
So when you say I have you didn't say these words exactly, but a version of you have a sense of yourself. Where is that localized? Because I've become obsessed lately with where the localization of self is in my body, and because on the continuum of experience of splitting or otherwise, there's everything from Richard Schwartz sort of functional self-embracing dialoguing with
yeah,
self,
yeah,
and then on the other end, it's dissociative identity disorder and parts,
yeah.
so
Or ADD, which is another form of dissociation, any of
ADD.
those. So what I would say in response to that question is to ask you who's asking the question. And it's your mind asking the question. And your mind will never get the answer.
Right, because the ego can't find out about spirit as such. It can chase words, right? But it can't really have a physical embodied experience of that which is beyond ego in a way. Is that what you mean?
Well, again, this is a conversation between two minds, and we're talking about something that's maybe beyond the mind. But
Mm-hmm.
again, to go back to your interview with Dan Siegel,
Mm-hmm.
I heard him at some point speak about some transcendental, deep, oceanic experience
With
where he felt we got the unity and he got the love and he got the oneness of everything,
yes, the
right?
wheel of awareness, almas,
Yeah,
mama.
yeah.
Yes.
Now, those experiences are available. I've never had it
No,
in that
the glimpse of the
anywhere near.
divine.
No, no, I've never had it in that clear sense. I may have, in certain situations, have some glimpses, but I, I
Mm-hmm.
I can't say that I've had that experience.
Mm-hmm.
But I totally know what he's talking about, even though I haven't. I can't say I've had the experience. What in me knows the truth of what he's talking about.
Yeah,
When I can't claim to have
direct experience.
consciously had that direct experience,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
well, the fact that I know the truth of what he's talking about tells me that yes, I'm here, because
Yes.
that's the part that knows.
Yes, there is
And
a
now
suchness,
when you ask me where that
the
embodied, all
localization.
I can
Yeah.
tell you, all I can tell you is that when I'm speaking to you now, and I'm not claiming that this is the spot, I'm just telling you what
Mm-hmm.
I'm experiencing at the
Yeah,
moment,
I want to know.
which is here at the center of my bottom lower center of, actually, it's about my solar plexus is where
Okay.
it is, actually,
Okay.
just below the chest cavity, and just and whatever chakra that is, whatever plexus that is.
Power, like
When I
the
when Yeah, yeah, that's where it's speaking to for me at this moment, and
hmm.
I don't want to make any claims for it.
Yeah, it
I'm just
might be
saying,
different at another time, maybe, or not.
yeah, but
Yeah.
what I'm saying is that whatever it is, it's experiential, and it's not something the mind can answer.
Yes, and I love the who's asking that, and the big sort of
Yeah.
repeated inquiry of who am I, who am I, who am I, what, those incredible dyads you can get into where you go all the way down into, what is love and who am I, and really can access.
You've done that enlightenment intensive process. Is that right?
Yeah, I've taken a lot of trainings and gone to different workshops. I've had a lot of teachers, and then I'm now in a privileged position to be a student and teacher. So I love teaching, and I
Mm-hmm.
facilitate all
Mm-hmm.
kinds of experiential exercises whereby people can access aspects of themselves that have been outside of their awareness. And also for me, I'm putting on an embodiment symposium in the new year, just approaching the body from certainly somatic experiencing and trauma informed awareness, all the way, right down to,
Okay. So let me ask you then.
yeah,
So you've done all this work, and you actually have gained all this mastery, and you're doing all this teaching.
sort of. Yeah.
Have you?
Yeah. I'm in the middle of
Well,
it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Okay. So in all that,
Mm-hmm.
have you had a sense of what the answer to your question is? Of where it's located. Have you ever had any sort of even momentary
A
uh,
sense of where it's localized.
sense of it or touch of it? Have you? I'm not even asking you to tell
Yes.
me where
Yes.
in your body it is, but I'm just asking you if you've had that sense or not.
Well, I could actually answer both. Yes, I've had the sense of it,
Okay.
and interestingly
Okay.
enough, it was in an IFS session, and
Okay.
and what happens with me is oftentimes, and I think this may be a common thing, I don't know, is a lot of times I've mistaken this sort of oneness, allness, suchness, capital S
Hmm.
self with the sort of
Hmm.
maternal mom part of me. So a
Hmm.
lot of times they want to blend, but once I kind of unblend them and ask them to sit next to me so that I can access the capital S self, the oneness part that
Yeah.
is not subject to
Okay.
duality and then it's
Okay.
all over. It's not in my face. It's not in my throat. It's the
Okay.
entirety of being that I feel. It's very warm, very compassionate. Richard talks about the C's: creative, compassionate.
Okay.
And
Okay.
so,
Well, if that's the case,
mhm,
then that's the answer to your question
right.
of of will it be decades more of intense therapy? No, it doesn't need to be. It
Nice.
just needs to be not just. It's not just just. It's not simple. It's not easy, but it needs to be more contact with that very part of you, or that self of yours. And
Yes.
the more we're in touch with that, the less therapy we actually need.
Right.
Now,
Right. Nice.
it's also true, and I'm doing a workshop on this in Santa Cruz in March. It's possible to have great spiritual experiences,
Yes. The spiritual
but not
bypassing.
do the spiritual, that's right, and not do the emotional work. In which case, these wonderful events that people experience just become memories or even
Yeah.
boosts to the ego.
Yes.
But nevertheless, if one knows not to do that spiritual bypass, then I do think that the more that connection exists, the less therapy is required.
Yes, because ultimately, isn't therapy a facilitation back to that? I mean, that's ultimately, I
I
think, what we're all going in to receive is love and that sense of oneness and that inextricable link between all of us. You know, we want the ocean, and we're these adorable, incredible, well-meaning drops. We're, a
That's
lot of
right.
us
That's right.
maladapted all over the place, but we're yearning for the ocean and that which is not subject to duality. So that would be the antidote to the fear of thinking that therapy would have to continue even after the grave.
But by the way, if it does have to continue,
Hmm.
I say so be it.
Oh yeah, it's all like
It's and so
a fluffing back to the original wholeness. So it's a
that's
sacred act. It's a sacred journey. But speaking to the epitaph that you have, it is a lot more work than I thought. But you know what? It's work that I'm up for, because the other option is to shut down and, frankly, to be consumed by these addictive processes and people and behaviors and die. So I mean, I'm gonna die, but I'd like to stay as long as possible.
well, we're all going to die,
Yeah.
to quote one of my spiritual teachers,
Hmm.
we don't have to commit slow suicide.
Yes.
You know,
Yes. The self harm and and last
and,
thing, yeah,
but also just by shutting down ourselves.
right.
You know,
And being the walking dead in a way. I mean, it's,
yeah.
this vitality. I mean, so much of the urgings and the cravings for me are about the pleasure and the vitality and the aliveness of being, combined with the relief
Mhm.
from the stress and the overstimulation and the constriction. So you briefly mentioned ADD and it being sort of, you threw it in a category of the effects on children, challenging childhood, but also particularly around the stress of the parents, and not to diss
Yeah. Yes.
parents. I understand the stress of the parents officially, but can you tell me a little bit about that, to support people who may have it themselves, but also have children who have it?
If I could be self-serving here, I'll mention the first book that I wrote,
Yes.
the Canadian title of which was Scattered Minds,
Mm-hmm.
and you look at the origins and healing of attention deficit disorder,
Mm-hmm.
and the American title of which is Scattered, How ADD Originates and What You Can Do About It.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm actually saying about it, and if you look at the statistics, and the more and more is being diagnosed and medicated, the whole idea that this is a genetic disorder, they consider it to be the most heritable mental illness there is.
Hmm.
I totally reject that view.
Yeah.
First of all, I don't think it's an illness. And secondly, I don't think it's heritable. I could go into all the science of it, and just because something runs in families, it doesn't make it genetic, of course.
Right.
But the essence of it is, it's not an illness, it's a coping mechanism.
Nice.
When people are stressed and they have no way of escaping or fighting back or seeking help, their brains will automatically tune out.
Right. Or
Now,
dart, right? Like, for me, is there an element of the mania is probably too
it's the same.
intensive a word, but like
It's the same. It's the same thing. Yeah.
yes, the darting.
It's this chaotic,
Yes.
this chaotic running to and fro, mentally or physically.
Yes, or both.
But those are both coping mechanisms to get away from the present moment, which is unbearable.
Yes.
Now, for the young infant, if the parents are stressed, then there's no escape, there's no asking for help, and there's no fighting back. All the child's brain can do is to tune out or to scatter the attention all over the place.
Yes.
And this is happening when the brain is developing.
Mm.
So that gets programmed into the brain as the default setting of the brain.
Mm.
So what begins as a coping mechanism now is later on turned to pathology.
Mm.
But I'm saying, by the way, I just have to really clarify here. I'm not blaming parents.
No,
I
I
think,
know.
and yeah, but a lot of people think I'm blaming parents.
Yeah.
I just want to be clear that I'm not. I'm not talking about bad parenting. I'm talking about stressed parenting.
Yeah.
And in society, there's so much stress on young parents, much
Yes.
more than there needs to be.
Well, with
for
no
reasons
villages, we're all losing our shit. We're
exactly
all
what you were
isolated.
talking about. And if the parents are stressed, especially the hypersensitive kids are very stressed,
Mm-hmm.
and so their brains will scatter their attention.
Yes.
But the good news is that if this is not a genetic disorder, but a developmental problem,
Yes.
then we go back to what we said before. Now the question we have to ask is not how do we change the behaviors of the child,
Mm.
but to how to understand the dynamics of why the child is behaving that way.
Yes.
And then how to create the conditions for healthy development.
Right.
Maybe we didn't get it right the first time. Maybe when they were small, mom was maybe depressed or she was stressed or the relationship was in trouble. All things that I can personally relate to.
Yep.
But now that we understand this, how about if we recognize that these kids are highly sensitive to the environment, and it's the environment we need to change. We have to understand what their behaviors are all about and what the emotional dynamics are. You know, to see them and feel them and understand them. And in that condition, they're then going to develop in a healthy way.
Yes.
And so if you see it as a developmental problem rather than a disease, you've got a much more
agency around supporting it and repairing.
That's exactly it. Yep. That's exactly it. You have agency and you have possibility, as opposed to all we can do is medicate. And by the way, I'm not totally against medication.
Sometimes
I'm taking
it's
them
appropriate.
myself.
Yeah, sometimes.
Totally. I'm just not the answer. They're not the answer. They're
not the long term. Yeah, not a long term answer. No. And one of the things that you're bringing to your whole body of work and in general is this quality of curiosity, to look under the hood. And so many people, when they're in a mode of self-harm or they're in a mode of being gripped by addiction, that and also certainly personality disorders, right? Narcissism and sociopathy and psychopathy, like the idea of curiosity and the willingness to go, well, what's happening here? All these pointed questions that you're asking. It's a muscle of inquiry. It's a muscle of looking. And so I think it's incumbent upon this is where I look to the macro and how sort of planetary service could be supported. For me, one tentacle of my contribution, or not contribution, but attempt at contributing would be to support people who are highly sensitive, who are philosophers, who are maybe a little more introverted and a little bit more inquiry minded and have that muscle of curiosity super cultivated, to support them in expressing and writing articles and teaching and writing books if they want, and just finding a way for their, whatever percentage they are, they're the 20% of people who are more apt to move toward this inquiry, that can come up with new solutions and new paradigms, to support those people with their temperaments or their resistance to being in the public eye, understandable resistance based on their temperament, is to support those philosophers and ministers and teachers and inward looking creatures, introspective teachers, to know that their voice is needed now more than ever. Because what we've been doing isn't working.
First of all, that's wonderful that you're committed to doing that. Thank God I don't need it. I once went to a course where they said, this is for people who are afraid to stand up in front of a group and say something. And I was going to say, how about something for people who are afraid not to stand up in front of a group and say something? But here's what I want to say to you. Really, you may choose to exercise what I'm going to say here. It's totally up to you. I have no agenda here.
I'm all ears.
I just want to tell you one thing. I've noticed a number of times in your conversation when you talked about your healing work and so on, you quickly threw in a kind of self-deprecatory comment.
Yep.
Like, or I try to, you said, or something like that.
Yeah.
Disclaim. Or when you've done all this work and you do have all this mastery, and then I said, and you said something like maybe. Now I understand that, but and
I'm also Canadian, so keep that in mind.
Yeah. But you know what?
I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying, and I appreciate it. It's probably a little bit of a social lubricant, my humor and self-deprecating thing. But
No. I actually think it's an old dynamic.
Yes.
That's what I would.
Well, it's the playing small thing that you might relate to, right? It's there's an element of my not having had the intelligence mirror combined with feeling isolated in how my brain and spirit and self-expression worked, So when I meet people like you and the lovely, inspiring people I've spoken with on this podcast and just, philosophers in general and especially in the psychotherapeutic biochemical science world, I feel like way less of a freak. And it feels really home to me. So thanks for saying that. And I will, I'll definitely stop with some of the caveats and the disclaimers that I do.
Well, so the second point I was going to make is don't try and stop it because you can't. It's automatic. Mm-hmm. Just notice it and be curious about it. Mm-hmm. To speak of curiosity.
Yes.
Okay. Just be curious about it.
Yeah.
You can't stop it because you're not doing it. It's not you doing it. It's not that you decide to do it often. If you're like me, it's sort of automatic.
Yeah. And Byron Katie talks about how the thoughts think us, So it's like.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing is about what you said about inquiry. So again, you can just leave this out totally if it doesn't work for you.
Yeah.
But I've just today got an email. We're launching an online course called Compassionate Inquiry, which is my method of working people, working with people. And so that's gonna be. It's actually called Compassionate Inquiry. It's the way I've learned to work with people, and
brilliant.
It's based on workshops that I've given on the subject, and so that'll be online in January. And if you're at all interested, we can send you. I can have Stephanie send you the information about it. If you're not interested, and if you don't want to sell stuff, please leave this out of the conversation altogether.
It's it's staying in. Thank you for mentioning it. And in your experience, is compassionate inquiry is it a muscle that you can teach to people? Or is it a predisposed kind of tendency toward introspective activity?
No, you can actually teach a lot of it. How it developed was that people kept telling me you should teach what you do. And I said, I have no idea what I do.
You're like, I don't know how to teach this.
To make a long story short, it turned out there was a teaching, and with the help of others, we distilled it, and it's become a very successful program that I've given to hundreds of therapists and counselors. Now, due to no thanks to my own efforts, it's becoming an online course and available to people. So that's why I'm mentioning it. It can be taught, yes.
Okay.
Certain gifts can't be taught, but a lot of people have their own gifts, and everybody will use whatever approach they learn in their particular way. Yeah, like
in their unique way.
That's exactly right.
Yes. Well, I feel as though I could continue going down each subject for another 100 miles with you, and I just want to take this moment to thank you so much for engaging in this conversation with me and for the large one that you're having in the world. God bless you. If there's anything I can ever do to support your unfolding mission, I'm here.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for being a philosopher archetypally. It's such an amazing part of you. It's such a joy.
Well, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Take care.
Okay, you too. Thank you, everyone, for listening. It's a joy to share these podcasts with you. I invite you to subscribe and join me on the next podcast. And until then, take care. I'll see you soon. Conventional kid, all intense.